The Navy's presence in the Bay Area had been in existence since 1853 when Admiral David Farragut first opened the Mare Island shipyard near Vallejo.
Prior to World War II, blacks were not permitted in the full Navy. I was one of the first 6 black men allowed in the full Navy. And I went through training at Great Lakes, Illinois. And after my boot training at Great Lakes, I was sent to Mare Island.
As the situation in the Pacific started to deteriorate in the late 1930s, early 1940s, it was obvious to the Navy that they were going to need larger areas for transshipment of the munitions. The Marines and the Army forces and the Navy were dependent on quick supply of the munitions necessary for them to prosecute the war. And so they immediately had their eye on the deepwater port facility in Port Chicago because it was adjacent to the major east-west railroad corridor that passed in this area.
Federal policy was not to build ammunition depots in the middle of industrial and populated areas, and so the director of the 12th Naval District wrote a letter and said that the reason that the Port Chicago site was so good was that it was not near any populated city and there was no industry in the area. Of course, he forgot about the town of Port Chicago with 2,500 people that was within a half a mile of the docks.
Initially, the Pacific War was not going good for the U.S. military forces in the Pacific.
And at that time, the Navy decided that they would build an ammunition depot at Port Chicago.
I didn't know anything about the plans from Port Chicago. In fact, I didn't know Port Chicago exists until they transferred me from Mare Island.
The initial Naval Magazine at Port Chicago had 600 acres, and it was basically covered the industrial area where the C.A. Smith Lumber Company, where the smelter, where the shipyard had earlier been.
Now, when we first arrived at Port Chicago, it still wasn't really ready. The barracks were finished, but they didn't have bunks in them yet. So in the first while we were there, we had to sleep on the floor.
The need for munitions during the war were incredible and tremendous. And because of that, the men who were working at Port Chicago were worked round the clock.
We handled ammunition from the smallest bullet to the largest bomb. And what most people don't realize, that we had 2,000-pound bombs.
The breakdown of the personnel assigned to the Naval Magazine were generally that the officers and the senior enlisted personnel, like the chief petty officers, were whites, and the weapons loaders, material handlers, were blacks.
One of the division officers was a pain. He had a habit of calling us "you people" and "boys." So I asked him, I said, "Sir, can we talk man to man today rather than officer to enlisted man?" He said, "Oh yeah, why the hell not?" I said, first of all, don't call me "you people." I said, and don't call me boy. I said, because there ain't no boys fighting this war.
None of these black guys that were loading the ships lived in the town of Port Chicago. It was a white town. They were all on active duty in the Navy and lived in housing that the Navy provided for them.
The blacks were generally not accepted in Port Chicago in the 1942 timeframe.
Some of the white areas, some of the people accepted you and some said, no, you can't come in here. It's just not that way.
So for their social activities, the blacks would generally travel to Oakland, Berkeley, and Richmond.
Well, one of the ways that the commandment was able to speed up the loading of the ships was to have competitions between the various groups.
Some people say they saw them betting, but I have officers ask me, he says, okay, Division 2 got 800 tons. Can we get 9?
And so they had contests to see who could load the most munitions.
All those munitions were transshipped, then loaded on the Liberty ships for their destinations in the Pacific War.
From where the barracks was to where the ships were being loaded was a good ways away from the barracks. So we had to get into these stake-body trucks. They didn't use a bus to take us down there. They used open-base trucks. We loaded in there, and they drove us to the pier.
They worked at an incredible pace to load ships as quickly as they could. And of course, all the loaders were black guys, and the pressure was put on them, incredible pressure.
No one gave us instructions how to do it. We eventually improvised our own ways. We figured out the best way to handle it and did it our way most of the time.
They were really being run day and night to load munitions as fast as they could. And there really was a disregard for safety.
A ship loaded with ammunition had 60,000 tons, not pounds, tons of ammunition aboard before it left.